And now it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. Before inviting him to the stage, I'd like to share a few words about him. Dr. Manuel Montoya's journey begins in the small town of Mora, New Mexico, where big dreams were nurtured in a close-knit community. Those roots carried him from Mora to the University of New Mexico as a Regents Scholar, and from the University of New Mexico to Oxford as the university's first Latinx Rhodes Scholar, and eventually onto the world stage as a leading voice in global political economy. His story embodies our theme, Little Learners, Big Futures, a reminder that when children are supported from the very beginning, their futures can stretch across borders and shape the world in extraordinary ways. We are honored to welcome Dr. Montoya as our keynote speaker. His story and insights will challenge us to see how the future of children today can shape the world of tomorrow. Dr. Montoya, de los nuestros del norte, venga aquí.
Good morning, everyone. Yeah, how's it going? Good. I'm really fired up about this. I'm really excited. Whenever there's a furry campfire outside of the room, you know that good things are going to happen. So I'm pretty excited about that. I have the greatest appreciation for not only educators, but for people who nurture the plasticity of young minds. And so I want to thank you all, Board of Directors, Alicia, Guillermo. I want to thank you all for inviting me and having me here for an opportunity to share with you just a little bit about my journey and a little bit about some thoughts I have about the future of the world economy. And I'm going to do this in 6 parts. So I hope that they all come together. I have a tendency to eventually get there. So if you guys find me kind of swaying a little bit, hold on, just give me just like a minute more, and I'll probably find that way to pull it together. That's just kind of how I get ready in the morning, and that's normally how I get everything together. I actually think that that's maybe a New Mexico trait that I'd like to probably talk about just a little bit in and of itself. I am from Mora, New Mexico, born and raised. That place has been since I was a child, population 3,000. I think it will be population 3,000 for the next century. It just tends to be a very static population in terms of the number of people who are there. But there is something about Mora and also New Mexico writ large that became very apparent to me during the Hermit's Peak Calf Canyon fires. And I remember the night that I had to bring my mom and my aunt over to my house, and my wife and I were just trying to tend to them and make sure that all of the materials that we had and all of the boxes that they had, that they were just, struggling to put together to make sure that, family heirlooms were not burnt down or anything like that. Just trying to find a place of peace. And I recall my mother lamenting the fact that she had left her rosary, her wedding rosary, back at the house. And she was also nervous about the tree that we planted at my father's grave in 1984. And she says, what if we lose these things? And I couldn't sleep that night because it made me think about what it would mean for the entire village to be washed away by a giant fire. And something in my mind kept going back to this thing that my mother would tell me. And it was actually the thing that she told me on the day that I left New Mexico for Oxford after graduating from UNM. She said, I will never take away from you what I cannot give you. Those words that she said, I've asked her many times in my life what she's meant by that statement. because she said it in moments of great exaltation, but she's also said it in moments of great fear, and also in moments of great uncertainty. And whenever I hear those words from her, I will never take away from you what I cannot give you. There's a part of me that splits in half, and it haunts me, because part of me wants to hold her and tell her that there is no one in the world who can give me anything more than what she's given me in her life with all the sacrifices she's made. And on the other hand, another part of me knows that she's giving me permission to be curious about the world and to explore it in a way that doesn't make me always long for a moment that once was. And that became pretty apparent to me in that kind of existential moment that Moreños were feeling during the fire. And it made me think a little bit about what I'm doing in my life, as any existential crisis would. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and tell you a little bit about my education. It starts in Mora for sure. I don't know. Oh, there I am. I'm trying to play guitar for the first time at the age of, I believe I was 6 there. And it's a Bee Gees guitar, don't judge. Yeah, they're awesome. The Bee Gees are really awesome and really underrated guitarists, apparently, because they had a signature guitar, and I got one for Christmas. But that moment for me reminded me of what it's like to find a lot of energy and enthusiasm around something that I had no experience or relationship to. I just thought that the guitar was beautiful, and I had heard really cool songs. I was a big fan of big fan of Elvis, and I would play 45s on my aunt's record player, and I would also listen to the Beatles and Led Zeppelin and all sorts of other things. But the shape of the guitar was what compelled me. There was something beautiful about the shape of a guitar. And the reason I say that is because when I was younger, I had a condition in my ear, in my inner cochlea, where the fluid in the cochlea would harden, and at that point I would lose balance, and it was highly likely that I was going to lose my hearing. And so thanks to the work of Dr. Paul Kaufman in Santa Fe, and after 7 surgeries, he was able to salvage the majority of my hearing, but it was very scary for my mom. And I remember even my grandma taking me to the santuario and putting some dirt, rubbing it on my ear. And right before I go into surgery, I tell Dr. Kaufman, yeah, my grandma put gravel in my ear. I don't know if this is going to work, because she put gravel in my ear. And my grandma, who was there, was not so happy with the indictment, but I remember the shape of the guitar meant something to me, because I think even at a young age, I recognized that there was a high possibility, and I even knew that. I could sense that I was not able to hear things in a way that other people were hearing things. And so when I saw that guitar, it was something really special to me, because for whatever reason, regardless of whether or not it was going to make a sound, I could have a relationship to it. There is a shape to all things. And I think even at that young age, there was something inside of that moment that reminded me, or became part of the DNA of my thinking. Because over time, I became both an economist and a literary scholar. I came to UNM and I decided to major in business, and I really liked that, but I was swayed over to the economics department because they were talking about the philosophical ideas that get you to think about what makes an economy what it is. But at the same time, I love literature. And so I really love this idea that the human imagination has a way of representing a complex idea. And however those two were playing out, I just couldn't choose between the two. So eventually I didn't, I picked both. And so I ended up going to a program at Emory University that was colloquially referred to as Unlikely Allies. And it was designed to be 2 PhD programs that basically put in conversation 2 different fields that don't talk to each other. So I have a background in comparative literature with a focus on world literature, and then a background on global political economy. And those 2 things are part of the fracture that I experienced as a young boy, hearing my mom say, "I will not take away from you what I cannot give you." I'm going to stop there with that story for a second. And I'm going to pick up this guy. So you're going to forgive me if you're really high-end nerds, because I'm going to refer to Voltron, and yes, I know this is not Voltron. So those of you that are going to be like, in comments and feedback, be like, that was a nice story, but he doesn't know what he's talking about. Yeah, I know this is not Voltron, but it is a representation of what I'm going to talk about. I have a little cousin who is a really precocious learner. He's really kind. I remember one time I picked up a bell from Bangladesh, an old copper bell, and in that bell, it made a beautiful sound because of the way that the wooden chime is cut into the bell. And I remember bringing some back for the kids, and I remember he, amongst all the children, put the bell on a little necklace. He went and he got a string together and he started to weave it together, and he was so happy, and he wore the bell around his neck, and I was like, I really like the cut of this guy's jib. He's really good. Like, he's really curious, and he's really kind. He also, I kind of have an affinity for him because he also, at a very young age, had to go through a lot of surgeries. At the age of 2 weeks old, he had open heart surgery, and he's constantly struggled with his health as a result of some of the chronic illnesses that he's had to struggle with. And he's never actually taken that as being the mark of how he engages with the world. But I remember one time he came to me, and I took him to see First Friday Fractals at the Museum of Natural History. And we were all going to go with the family to dinner, and he wanted to drive to dinner with me. And he was around 6 or 7 years old, and he asked me, "Uncle Minnow," which is what they call me back home, "Uncle Minnow, what do you do?" And I said, "Well, I'm a professor at the university." And he says, "I know that. I know that you're a professor, but what do you do?" And nothing can actually strike the fear of God in you more than a child asking you what you do and you have no real explanation for what it is you actually do. I actually lost my mind for like 2 seconds. I'm like, what the heck do I actually do? So I decided to get a little bit snarky, and I said, well, I study 19th century French epistemology, and I study that in the context of global political economy, and I tried to understand how that renders financial markets and also literary systems. And he looked at me like this look, I can't replicate it, so I'm not even going to try. He said, "Uncle Minnow," like very concerned. I guess that's the word I would say, concerned. He said, "Uncle Minnow, that's really stupid." Like, yeah, actually, you're quite right. That is actually quite stupid. Yeah. But he was insistent. I mean, that concern was pretty authentic and genuine. And he said, "No, Uncle Minnow, what do you do?" With that sincerity of purpose, how can you let down a child at that point? Like, I needed to figure it out, and I had to get my proverbial stuff together. I had in my mind, and I'm like, give me a moment. So, get onto the highway, and by the time we get on, I was like, I said, "Do you know Voltron?" And his eyebrow raised, kind of like The Rock. He just kind of did this thing, and he was like, "Go on." And I said, "Yeah, well, I study Voltron, man." He's like, "Okay, all right. Do you teach Voltron to the students?" I was like, "In a way I do, yeah. I'm making it up as I go along, so I'm like, yeah, I guess so. Let me figure out how the heck I do that." And he's waiting for me. He's like, this demands an explanation. And it finally occurred to me, because I know that he loved the new cartoon, not the 1980s cartoon. He liked the new one on Netflix, and he was watching it. And I said, "What is Voltron?" And he said, well, now you're dealing with my expertise. You could tell he drew a breath, and then he said, well, Voltron is a giant robot that is made up of all these lions, and these 5 lions, they don't get along. The yellow lion doesn't like the green lion. The green lion and the black lion, they're best friends, but they're going to be separated. And he has all this drama that he's playing out with these lions. And I said, well, what happens when each of the parts turn into Voltron? How does that happen? And he says, well, they come together when the universe is in trouble. That's why he's called Defender of the Universe. Like, duh. And I'm like, yeah, that's right. So he figured it out for me, actually. I said, look, man, and his name is Lucio. I said, look, Lucio, I study what happens when the whole becomes more than the sum of its parts. I study what happens when the lions come together, and I try to understand what it is about what happens when those lions decide to come together. I just do that in a different way, man. He drew a breath. He took about a 10-second pause. I thought he was going to fail me. And he was like, I would like to go to Buca de Beppo now. I was like, onward we go then. So we went off in our car, and we had a wonderful dinner. But since then, I actually found this at a yard sale, and I know that it's a Power Ranger. It's not Voltron. Please do not correct me on this. I know that. But it is this representation of the problem of assemblage of whole and parts. And when I study economics, I've actually had a really neat educational journey where I've got to study economics as a literary critic. And I've got to understand why it is that we choose things like books, famous books, and we decide to elevate them to represent national cultures and other sorts of things. And so Voltron becomes just one piece in the shape of the economy that I understand is happening in the world. And I'm going to get back to Voltron in a little bit, so that's number 3, right? I said 6. I have to get all 6 out, if not I can't stitch together the materials. Salman Rushdie. So when I went to Emory, I had the unique experience of being able to work with Salman Rushdie. For those of you that know, he's an author. He wrote, in the late 1980s, he wrote a book called The Satanic Verses, and a fatwa was issued out against him by the late Ayatollah Khomeini. And he mentioned Muhammad inside of the book in a way that ignited a bunch of controversy. And since then, he had written tons of books, one of which was my favorite one, is about a little girl in Kashmir. The name of the book is called Shame. I was a huge fan of his, but I didn't know that when I got into the Emory program that he would be the guest lecturer, the Elman lecturer for that year. But I got to actually work with him on a class on world literature. So it was a very unique experience that I had with him. And I remember him walking into the ballroom for the first time, and I always thought, I had heard that he was a very intellectual individual and that, maybe a little bit aloof, so I was very nervous to approach him. But I also heard that he liked gin. And so I bought a bottle of gin, really nice bottle of Bombay Sapphire gin, and I had it in a little basket with a ribbon, and it was sitting there on the table waiting for him because I was supposed to introduce myself at this moment. And when he walked into the ballroom, I'm not joking, he really likes gin, because he walked in and there was at least, be half the size of this room, but there was a lot of people in there. And I don't know if he just sensed it as a holy man, but he just kind of turned around and he saw the bottle of gin and he went right to me. And he was just like, well, hello. How you doing, sir? And he's just like, are you going to crack that open later on? And I said, actually, this is for you, sir. I'm Manuel Montoya. And he was like, oh, yeah. We're going to do that world literature thing. And I mixed him a nice gin and tonic. He actually says that it was a really good gin and tonic. 3 of them later, he decides to pull out a napkin and he starts writing down a few names onto the napkin, and he's like, okay, Manuel, you're my official mixologist from here on out. I was like, that's very nice. I thought he was going to say that I was like his best friend or something like that. We were a little happy. And he slides the napkin over to me and he says, these are the books I think we should teach for the class. I looked at them. Alice in Wonderland, very nice. 100 Years of Solitude, yeah. The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, The Tin Drum. I started to realize a pattern in all of the books that he was picking. They were all what we would call magic realist. And I asked him, I said, it's very interesting that you decided to pick these magic realist books. Why'd you pick them? And he said, they just naturally feel to me what world literature is, just instinctively. And I thought that was interesting because for the most part, when I had taken classes in world literature, it was kind of a greatest hits of nations. It was the greatest hits of nations. Like, what are the great books from England? What are the great books from Zimbabwe? What are the great books from Australia? And then you put them all in a compendium and you read them, and it's kind of this collection. It's the parts. It's just a collection of parts. And we look at the parts and we start paying attention to them. Yeah, we appreciate them, right? But for me, they never actually satisfied what it meant to be world literature. And so when he chose these books, I said, this is really interesting. Did you pick 100 Years of Solitude because it's the greatest work to ever come out of Colombia? And he said, no. He said, no. I was like, well, did you pick The Tin Drum because you think it's the greatest German novel of all time? He said, nope, no. Picked The Master and Margarita, good Russian novel. He said, I picked them because they have magic in them. And there's something that Gabriel Garcia Marquez said when he won the Nobel Prize in Literature. He actually was very annoyed by the interviewer because he was like, this is such a wonderful book. You must be so proud of yourself. Yeah, you got a Nobel Prize in Literature, but it was really condescending. You can see it on YouTube. It's very, very irritating to watch the way that he's treated in this interview. But they're like, why is it that your people feel like writing about magic whenever you're doing your storytelling? To which he very straight-faced turned to the interviewer and said, there is nothing magic about magic realism. And that was the end of the interview. And Mr. Rushdie insisted that precept would be the organizing feature of how we would work with students to talk about what is a world literature. All right, that's 4. So 5. 5 happens with a conversation I was having with the Federal Reserve Bank and some officials from the World Bank. So in my career thus far, I have visited 67 different countries. I have been able to see places that I never thought in a million years I would see. I got to see a vantage point at the top of the Amazon rainforest where you can actually see the tree line. You can see the shape of the planet because you can see as far as you can go, the tree line will actually reveal the shape of the planet. And that's something pretty powerful that just sticks with me all the time. And these are the sorts of things that I did call my mom up and I'm like, Mom, I'm hoping that I can bring you one of these days to check this out because it's so beautiful. And she would say, that's wonderful, mijo. That's wonderful. And part of me is just kind of angry because I didn't get to take her with me and I didn't get to take other people that I love with me to see these things. So, but I'm getting to see these things. So I'm doing that whole split thing again. And I'm trying to figure out what's going on in my head. But I'm having this conversation. It's a forum on the future of the world economy. And the person presenting noted a couple of key points that I'm going to share with you. These are little factoids about the world economy that maybe you can take home and disseminate, right? In 2003, 2 things happened. 1, a Goldman Sachs investor writes a report that indicated that the majority of investment strategy should be dedicated towards investment in Brazil, Russia, India, and China, what we now refer to as BRIC, South Africa wasn't included at the time. We call it BRICS. You can read in the paper and in popular media now, the word BRICS is actually quite a common phrase. But back then, nobody had ever heard of this grouping, this assemblage of these pieces of a puzzle that this investor says makes perfect sense, and I'll tell you why. Brazil and Russia contain at least 25% of the world's strategic natural resources. And his argument was Brazil alone contains 20% of the world's breathing air. I had never heard it put in that context, but it blew my mind at that point. I said, oh my God, that's right. The Amazon rainforest does actually contain 20% of the world's breathing air. And so when you think about that, then one of the questions that follows in my head is, so is Brazil in charge of 1/5 of the world's breathing air? That's interesting. And as the conversation went on, India and China get mentioned as a significant portion of the world's population. And this grouping, which had never really been paired together for many different reasons, one of which is that the shapes of these economies don't really fit with each other. They're not congruent with each other. Like if you remember Sesame Street, one of these things is not like the other. One of these things, they're not like each other. They're all not like each other. It's like that song would go on forever if you wanted to talk about how they're less alike than each other than how they're more alike than each other. It's not like the European Union, which tries to identify itself as European by having some sort of cultural and social history that it organizes around itself. Or Latin America. Like we see Latin America and we have an idea of Latin America, but we don't have an idea of what BRIC is. It's a weird pairing. It's a strange shape in the economy. What I find interesting about that moment was the second thing that the speaker said, and he said, note that of the 7.5 billion of the world's population at the time, over 4 billion of the world's population make less than 2,000 US adjusted dollars. 4 billion. Like is that right? So he pulls up this giant pyramid and it's the distribution of global wealth, and he's like, 0.7% of the world's population makes over $100,000. 0.7%. This was 2003, right? But he's trying to show something that's pretty powerful. It stuck with me for a long time. In fact, that was a very pivotal moment in my economic career, because the shape of those economies, I'm sorry, I don't know if my P's are just really loud. I don't know what's going on there, but I apologize for that. But the shape of the economy, as he was describing it, was about the world's largest grouping of people. He had figured out a way to contain and conceptualize the world's largest, a majority of the world's population, as making less than 2,000 US adjusted dollars, and insisted, this is before the 2008 financial crisis, he insisted you avoid the base of that global income distribution at your own peril. As an economist, as a person thinking about economic development, if you avoid that group of people, if you're always focused on the top, if you avoid that group, you will lose. You will always lose. It's kind of interesting that over 20 years, that base has now gotten a bit of a belly. It actually is not a pyramid anymore. It's actually now shaped with a middle curve, because over 2 billion of that population, since and even during the 2008 financial crisis, that average income has increased to 23,000 per year. And that was an indication of a kind of global growth that most people don't pay attention to. It was paying attention to those economies that nobody ever pays attention to. And during the financial crisis, many of these economies didn't know, and nobody gave them the memo, that the world economy had gone through a financial crisis. Because these are economies that, by and of themselves, are mutual aid economies. They're very resilient economies. They don't rely necessarily on the same structures of trade. They don't appear in the same marketplaces. And I was like, holy cow. After that presentation, I was really moved by this idea that we don't know the shape of the world economy. I teach macroeconomics sometimes, big classrooms, 150 students. And when I ask them to think about the macroeconomy, I ask them to think about the shape of the economy. Why is it that when we measure the world economy, for example, we measure it in US dollars? Why is it that Russia is not part of the European economy? Why is it that Turkey is not part of the European economy? Why is it that Mexico got invited to be part of the Latin American Mercosur system in 2011? They're not South American, but in some weird way, there was some invitation because there was a connection between these economies. And I tell my students, I said, when you study economics, you're studying shapes. And your economics is only good as your understanding of an economy when you know the shape of the economy and you know what is containing all of the transactions and ideas that make an economy what it is. Here's the secret that a lot of economists won't tell you. We don't know what the shape of the world economy looks like. We don't. We struggle. We look for a vocabulary to do it, but we live in a world where we are actually defined by some very, very flat concepts, and one of which are national economies. We actually insist on them. We insist on them so much that we think that whenever we need to do economic activity to solve the world's problems, that we have to first take care of our national economy, and this, that, and the other. And it becomes the same problem as this guy right here. We know the parts, we don't know what actually happens when the parts become the whole. That's fine. I'm going to now share with you, I'm going to go back to the kid that liked the guitar and wasn't always very good at playing the guitar. So, I remember when I graduated from college, I would watch and observe many of my classmates who were really good guitarists and a lot of artists, and I would long for being able to have that kind of talent. I will say that in my lifetime, there are guitarists out there that'll forget more than I'll ever learn in my lifetime. That's not what I'm here on this planet to do. But I do like the shape of the guitar. And I like the shape of the guitar because of how I was raised, and also I like the shape of the guitar because of how it reminds me that I can't take for granted the quality of sound that I might lose one day. And so I've always been drawn to the shape and the images of guitars. And I actually find it interesting that most people actually buy a guitar before they ever play it. They fall in love with the color, they fall in love with the style, they fall in love with the knobs. I'm actually writing a book right now that talks about the shape of guitars, primarily electric guitars, and why it is that our global trade system actually relies on the visual aesthetic appeal of certain things before we actually get into their overall quality, quantity, or even their value proposition. And so when I think about all of that stuff, I go back to be that little kid, and I wonder, why am I so obsessed with shapes? Why am I so obsessed with trying to explore and understand the shape of the world economy? Why is it that I'm trying to understand the shape of things when I feel like the world is coming apart? And I remember recently taking my mom, I'm a mama's boy, you can tell, right? Did you get that one? Yeah. I remember taking her to watch the movie The Bride. I don't know if it's a good movie, and I don't know if I can recommend it, but it's actually a pretty interesting movie. It's a remake of Bride of Frankenstein, and about an hour in is when I really started to love the movie, because there's one moment in the movie, no spoiler alert, there's one moment where the main character, the bride, turns around and turns to the mad scientist and says, "Do you know why you hate me? And do you know why you cannot appreciate me? Because I am a disobedient geometry." Boom. For me, every time I see a shape, I have to ask myself, what the heck is going on in the state of New Mexico? that when we talk about economic development, labor rates, brain drain, healthcare, job growth, all of these other indicators of like the health and welfare of the state, we always seem to be a state that doesn't get to participate as a competitive part of that system. Colorado, Texas, Arizona. I often hear from some of my colleagues in other parts of the world, why is it that New Mexico can't get its stuff together? To which I never really have an answer, I just get really angry. And I get really upset, and I try to search for an understanding of that. And then I'm reminded by little kids that love Voltron. I'm reminded by my mother, I'm reminded by Salman Rushdie, I am reminded by people who are talking about the future of the world economy and BRICS, and I'm also reminded by the state of New Mexico that we are a disobedient geometry. We are not the shape we think we are, and everybody is trying to put us in the wrong shape context. We are a state where preservation and progress constantly are at odds with each other, and for whatever reason, we are stubborn in the best way possible. We like to preserve tradition, so much so that we would be willing to die for trees that are planted for our parents. We are people who will do whatever it is. We will die on many hills. We will die for language, we will die for culture, we will do all of these other really, really powerful things, and at the same time, we are the location where quantum computing, where nuclear weapons and atomic weapons are developed. We are a place where high technology is constantly there. We are in two similar worlds all the time. We're kind of like the Hulk and Superman, constantly battling each other. We are the unstoppable force and the immovable object all the time. And every time I hear an economic development discussion, growing up as a kid, I'm saying that's the shape of New Mexico. We're not one or the other, we are both. Not only are we both, incidentally, as the literary side of me, we are also the place, the number one place in the United States where science fiction writers and fantasy writers reside per capita. We're a place where fantasy and magic actually have a very meaningful part of the way that we bring together an unstoppable force and an immovable object. We are both of those things, and we are smart enough to know that you can't do that with cliches. You cannot tie those things together with what is known. You have to understand the shape of the unknown. And to do that, you must be creative. You must be somebody who embraces magic and the possibility of futures. You must be all of these things that I actually grew up knowing inherently. That Garcia Marquez very frustratingly said, there is nothing magic about magic realism. There is nothing fantastical or unsophisticated about New Mexico. It is actually a place that is trying to maintain a shape that is both fluid and solid at the exact same time. While other economies throughout the world are trying to understand how to retain its shape, we are a place that has figured out how to be resilient in the face of existential crisis. Now, the one last thing is I want to say, I got into this idea of playing guitar, and I'm not a good one, but I got into a conversation with a guitar maker. And this guitar maker is a very special one. He was the student of a very famous guitar maker by the name of Ken Parker, and who recently passed away last year. But his whole design journey was about making sure that people understood that a shape is not a shape until you make something with it. And I always found that to be compelling because it kind of goes into my whole ethos about like being a disobedient geometry, even though I didn't even know what those words meant at the time. And so over a period of the past 2 years, as I've been working through, trying to think through economy through the lens of the visual appeal of guitars, I asked him to build me one. And this was actually a tribute to his teacher. And he said, I want to build you something that reminds you of your childhood and all these stories. And I told him about my little cousin I told him about what I study, and he said, I want to give you a giant robot that is a shape without a shape. Actually, I want you to play something that has empty spaces inside and outside of them. And so what he did, very interestingly, after 192 emails, and over a period of 1.5 years, he built me this heartbreakingly beautiful thing. And he put a heart on the top, and on a handmade sterling silver piece on the head of the neck here. And he said, I want you to have this guitar, and I want you to know that in making this guitar, you killed a lot of pain that I had. So I'm going to call it Painkiller. And I've tried to play it. I actually think that in the small hours of the night when nobody can hear, I actually think that beautiful songs were actually made with this guitar. But I also know that every time I look at it, and every time that I think about sound and I think about the shape of the world economy, I hear my mom saying, I will never take away from you what I cannot give you. I don't know when the world economy and when the times we live in are going to finally arrive at the conclusion that every time we think we know what we know, we become further addicted to our self-righteousness. And in doing so, we insist upon a system that never really existed. And I have to ask myself, if we're going to do anything that makes this world a resilient and vibrant place, then we have to have minds like my little cousin. And we have to have kids that have to make believe, and they have to believe in the shape of things in new and interesting ways. But they're also going to be the leaders that are going to understand that the economy is not the economy we think it is. And they're going to be the ones that are going to have to figure out how to make that economy flexible enough to contain the old ideas and to insist on respecting tradition, while at the same time leaving empty spaces in between so that we can fill them with interesting concepts and let those ideas actually live as a meaningful part of our realities. The philosopher Hannah Arendt once said that cliches are a way for us to avoid our reality. When we assume that we know the shape of a thing and we know that the way that the world works, we slip into those cliches and we convince ourselves that we don't have to think anymore about the world that we actually live in. But I love this state because it is a disobedient geometry. I love New Mexico because it is magic. And I love New Mexico because if you look at the trends that are going to make the world economy what it is, it's not going to be the great power economies of the world that are going to make it work. It's going to be those smaller economies who actually operate in a very, very different logic. Hannah Arendt also said that there are two forces in society that we constantly have to live in. We look to the past to maintain the state, that is the time of politics, and we look to the future when we think about progress, which is the time of economics. When groups of people choose one over the other and don't find a space in between to communicate with each other, that is when fascism occurs. I have to believe that New Mexico is actually a solution that people have not yet recognized. Because if you look at the trends in the world economy, bricks are not going to be the dominant economy of the world. There's a new concept out there. It's called MINT, because people like acronyms, I guess. Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. And the way that that discussion is evolving is not about resources. It's not even about people. It's about resilience. It's about economies that have high informal economies, that have high craft sectors, that have highly and ancient traditions that are constantly at odds with progress and high technology, but that embrace both. And I don't think I'm interested in sharing with you why each of these economies are doing what they're doing. But I would actually impress upon you, if you ever hear that term, you're going to hear it being talked about as the future of world economies that are not acting as competitors to rise to the top of the global income pyramid. They are occupying the shape of the base of the pyramid. Así es Nuevo Mexico. And that is why I love this place, but I also insist that if I'm going to be an active part of how I contribute to that vocabulary, I must be a disobedient geometry. The last thing I want to say, to try to tie it all together. Whenever I think about economics, I've shared with you a couple of thoughts that are kind of disjointed. But whenever I think about children, and I think about their role in shaping the world, I'm often reminded that we use the word minor to ascribe or describe what a child is. And I've always found that word minor to be interesting because we use the word minority in so many different ways. But my favorite philosopher of all time, his name is Gilles Deleuze. He wrote a book called Towards a Minor Literature. And it was a book, he was studying Kafka, of all things. But inside of that book, he makes a point about minority. Not minorities in the way that we use it, like ethnic minorities or gendered minorities or class-based minorities. That's not what he's talking about. He's saying there is a problem in the world whenever we decide to politicize anything, whenever we decide on the shape of a thing. We always have the problem of becoming minor. He postulates that there is no group of people in human history who have ever called themselves a people who have ever been a majority. Think about the 4 billion of the world's population. That 4 billion is often referred to as a group of people with powerful economic potential, but they're never seen as the majority. They are minor because of their annual income or any other number of reasons. Any time a people are evoked, and I just want to leave that with you as a proposition. Is it true that any group of people can never consider themselves a majority when they claim themselves as a people? The second part of that, he argues, is that the only thing that we can do whenever we identify a group of people is to summon them. And that we are obsessed as human beings with summoning people. If that is true, then the work of a minor, particularly the work of children, is to summon people. And the work that we all have as people who safeguard their journey to be safe and vibrant and thriving thinkers is to summon them. And to summon groups of people in the best way we can, not to essentialize them, not to put them in a box, not to essentialize them and not to help them, but rather to accompany them, to join them, and to learn from them. If we can learn how to summon people, then I think we get the gist of why New Mexico is what it is, and I think that's why I finally understand my mother. I think that's why I get her. I will never take away from you what I cannot give you. I really appreciate your time today, guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Montoya. We'll open it up for some questions if you have. I just kind of want to take a pulse real quick of this room. You know, he and I are the same age. You know, I grew up in Espanola, born and raised. I moved here in 1995 when I graduated high school. You all can do the math, okay? It was a big deal. It was a big deal, you know, growing up in these small villages and coming to this big city and trying to make something of yourself. And I don't want to start to cry, but it was a big deal, and it still is. And in this room, how many are you from these small villages? How many are you from rural New Mexico? Stand up if you are from rural New Mexico, in any part of the state. And from the metro area. Either way, you are educating our youngest learners, our youngest New Mexicans, and you know, one of them may just well be taking the global stage, just like Dr. Manuel, or being the executive director of a nonprofit someday. I'm going to go ahead and hand it back to Dr. Manuel. If any of you guys have any questions, if not, we'll move on with our day.
Yeah. I know that that's cryptic. I know what I said was a lot of stuff that sometimes doesn't connect. I do that on purpose because I want to see where people's minds go. So if you guys have any questions, I'm pretty good at tying stuff together. When you give me a question, I give you an answer that I can best come up with. So if anybody has a couple of questions, I'd love to hear them. That's a brilliant question. Why is it that we always get misunderstood, and why are we always mismeasured? Why are we always 50th? I actually have a tagline that I use in one of my classes. I said, New Mexico is not the 50th state, it's the first emerging economy. And then I just leave it at that. Because I actually think that New Mexico understands more what it's more important to become rather than to be. I don't think we're good with data. I don't think we're good with data because we're people who we're flexible, we move around a lot, and it's very hard to measure becoming rather than being. We love storytelling. We love improvisation. We love a lot of that logic, and New Mexicans are always becoming. They never really are. And that's one thing that I think we get misunderstood about. Yeah, we are. And we're always like Alice in Wonderland, we're never the right size. Yeah. Let's take a moment to recognize that, yeah. I think what I credit a lot of that to, and I want to thank you for all the work that you do on that, is that you guys have figured out a strategy to measure the creativity of the human mind in ways that we often disregard. And you guys have actually leaned into many of the other things that make what makes being curious in the world actually, especially in the crisis of, I'm not going to call it a crisis, but the AI, our confrontation with artificial intelligence. Yeah. More than ever now, people are going to need to have a humanities education as much as a data analyst training, because otherwise you're never going to be one or the other. You have to be both. Yeah. So thank you for the work you do. Any last questions or comments? All right, thank you so much for your time, guys. I really appreciate it.